Hello, I'm LegenTerry and this is Final Fantasy XVI, the character action JRPG developed and published by Creative Business Unit 3 of Square Enix. Let me start with two things. Firstly, no, you don't need to have played Final Fantasies 1 through 15 to understand what's happening in this game. Each Final Fantasy game that isn't directly called out as a sequel is its own standalone story in its own standalone world with similar elements and monsters. Please stop asking this question, it's just one Google away, that's all it takes. Secondly, this game is f***ing cool. Final Fantasy XVI is probably the largest, most ambitious departure from the norm for the franchise since Square launched their first MMO, Final Fantasy XI. Naoki Yoshida, the director of their current MMO, Final Fantasy XIV, was brought on to produce and direct the narrative. They doubled down on the Western influence, looking to franchises like Game of Thrones for the story and the tone. They worked with Ryota Suzuki, the combat director responsible for games like Devil May Cry 5 and Monster Hunter World, to shape the way battles feel. And they got Final Fantasy XIV's highly renowned composer, Masayoshi Soken, to write the music for the game. The amount of talent that these guys and all of Creative Business Unit 3 bring to the table cannot be understated. In Final Fantasy XVI, you play as Clive Rosfield, a disgraced prince of the Kingdom of Rosaria. The reason he's disgraced is because he was not born with the power of an Icon, as is expected from his lineage. Icons are massive creatures that command an elemental aspect, which were formerly known as summons in previous entries. Those born with the power to embody the Icons are called Dominants, and Clive's younger brother, Joshua, was the one to inherit the Fiery Phoenix in his stead. From here, we're going to run into some spoilers for those that haven't seen the first couple hours of the game or played the demo, so if you want to jump past them, here's a timestamp. And if you'd rather watch it, there's a link for my demo playthrough in the description below. I'll give you a moment to make up your mind. Clive and Joshua's father, King Elwyn Rosfield, believes that war is imminent, as the northern region of their territory succumbs to a blight that ravages the land and leaves it uninhabitable. You see, the world of Valisthea operates on magic, and magic can only be found in a few places. The Dominants, which I already explained, crystals, which allow anyone who controls them to use magic, and people who have the innate ability to wield magic known as bearers. Bearers are seen as less than human by everyone else, so they are turned into slaves for the kingdoms. The blight sucks up all of the magical ether in the land, and so civilization has gathered up around the mother crystals, enormous mountain-like crystal shards that hold vast amounts of magical power. As land becomes the limited resource, all the kingdoms war with one another and rely on the power of their own dominance, essentially acting as atomic bombs on the battlefield when their forces are overwhelmed. Believing the power of the Phoenix to be necessary for the coming conflict, Elwyn and Clive take him to their ceremonial grounds to perform his rite of passage. Unfortunately, their platoon is ambushed in the night. The king is beheaded, Joshua transforms and loses control of his power, and as Clive attempts to intervene, a hooded stranger appears and a new icon of fire is summoned, murdering Joshua. Clive is captured and enslaved by his assailants and his own mother, who betrayed their kingdom, and he now makes it his life's mission to get revenge for Joshua's death. I'm loving the starker setting, as Final Fantasy has always been slightly adverse to getting its hands too dirty with harsh subject matter. Not that it ever truly avoided it, but it's awesome seeing the team get to write and embrace a more mature plot with elements that are actually tangible and relatable for once. In the past, it's always felt like style was prioritized over substance, and here it's a much more grounded and reasonable balance between the two. Though Final Fantasy XVI wouldn't be a Final Fantasy game if it weren't also full of eye candy. You can choose between fidelity and performance modes. Of course, for me, performance will always be the winner. No matter which mode you choose, non-combat areas will run at slightly lower frame rates, which isn't great, but it's a passable compromise for how good everything looks. The world itself is gorgeous, and with this being a Final Fantasy game, you know the particle effects and the spells look beyond superb. The main characters look about as real as you're going to get without dipping into the uncanny valley, and of course the costumes are ridiculous, but a little more reined in than previous entries. Most of them fit pretty nicely within the medieval European aesthetic the team was going for. I've never been a massive fan of the over-designed creatures in Final Fantasy, but at least they're hitting closer to their mark for realism with the power of the current generation of consoles behind them. Some of the cutscenes are lackluster. Most of the side quests involve chatting with NPCs who don't know how to move the muscles in the top half of their faces. But the main in-engine cutscenes that dole out story content have never looked more visually stunning. I've lost count of the amount of times that something incredibly epic would take place and give me goosebumps. Just like when someone hits those like and subscribe buttons on my videos. The English voice cast delivers a stellar performance all around. Actor and giant gaming nerd Ben Starr gives it his all as Clive, with some gut-wrenching emotional beats topped with a healthy portion of brooding. Ralph Ineson landed the charming, one-liner slinging role of Sid in this game immediately following his casting as Lorath in Diablo 4, which was funny to hear. And all of the actors portraying the dominance keep the heavy story moments feeling grounded and give the massive set-piece cinematic fights an extra jolt of energy. When Masayoshi Soken got announced as the composer for this game, I think that every single person on Earth who knew his name from Final Fantasy XIV popped off. This is the prodigy who was mentored by Nobuo Uematsu, who many people believe to have become equal to or even surpassed in some aspects. It's pretty clear that his work speaks for itself, and this game is no exception. The soundtrack is an immaculate ode to the days of Final Fantasy past and the new future 16 presents. Leitmotifs from Uematsu's body of work are sprinkled throughout the course of the game, interjected with bombastic icon battle themes and melodies that draw on each character's struggles with the version of reality they're forced to confront. But the star of the show might be the new combat system. Final Fantasy hasn't truly been turn-based in quite some time, but 16 bucks the trend completely. While 7 Remake is taking a more measured approach to keep the fanbase of the original happy with a blended action and menu system that can basically freeze time, this one is a capital A action game. There's no time to catch your breath here, it is 100% flashy, combo threading, precision dodging, counter-clashing mayhem. This shift in the way that you do battle might be the most controversial change in 16, but it's also the most refreshing. At the start, you'll probably feel limited in the way that you can handle encounters, as you only get a few of the Phoenix's powers to play with. A lot of sword swinging, dashing in with Phoenix Shift, throwing a fireball or two, dodging, and waiting for the enemy's stagger gauge to break before unloading your special moves. As you progress deeper into the story, Clive gets access to more icon powers, which fill out his bag of tricks. Each icon basically acts as a stance you can shift between, having their own dedicated movesets tied to the R2 plus square or triangle, and a unique ability on circle, depending on your controls. Some are all-out damage dealers, some create openings for aerial combos, some can counter enemy attacks, and so on. Mastering these abilities on the skill tree also allows you to assign them to any icon stance, giving you more options to use them when you run out of space. There are a couple of drawbacks to this system though. At the time of recording, there are only 3 control schemes with no player rebindable buttons, so if you have a problem with it, you're just going to have to suck it up and get used to one of them. Or change your controls on the system level in the PS5's accessibility menus, but that unfortunately doesn't change the on-screen button prompts in the occasional QuickTime event. This was a pretty big pain point for me in the demo, because I just couldn't remember that dodge was on R1 and the Phoenix Shift dash-in ability was on circle quick enough to evade attacks. Had I learned about that trick earlier, I probably would have had a better experience, but now the control scheme is too baked into my brain to escape using it. Speaking of accessibility, that's another odd quirk of Final Fantasy XVI's. Rather than give players menu options to adapt their difficulty outside of story and action focus modes, they introduced a set of items you get access to from the beginning of the game called Timely Accessories. They do things like automate standard combos and give you a larger window to land precision dodges, but they also take up valuable gear slots in your inventory. If you find something that you want to equip to upgrade your abilities, well, you're going to have to sacrifice your comfort to use it. It's really not a great way of handling this kind of thing, in my opinion, and I'm inclined to believe that most of the people speaking out about the topic agree. And on the topic of equipment, this might be my biggest complaint. The series has always been known as RPGs, but with its deviation into the action genre, it feels like some of that identity has been lost in translation. Mainly in the way that you would normally customize your experience by making unique loadouts and fitting characters for different roles. In Final Fantasy XVI, there are no other controllable party members besides Clive. You have his faithful dog Torgal to issue a couple of commands to, and a few characters that will follow you around doing their own thing, but none of what they do in fights feels impactful. You can't give them any gear that I'm aware of, and the gear that you can equip on Clive barely matters. Sure, you pick up new weapons and armor pieces along the way, but most of them don't fundamentally change the way you tackle combat in any real way. It's kinda just making a number go up so that enemies take more damage and you take less. There's no more elemental weaknesses to plan around or status ailments to use or avoid. These were staples of the RPG genre that Final Fantasy once helped innovate, and they just aren't here anymore. It feels kind of like a whole layer of depth got stripped away and they couldn't quite find an effective way to put it back on. But I don't want you to think I'm nitpicking too much, because everything else about the combat is satisfying. It feels awesome to nail down the timing of enemy attacks, to effectively dodge and counter them, and to learn new combo patterns that flow into one another and play around the stagger meter. So far, Final Fantasy XVI has been one of my favorite experiences of the year, and I don't see it falling off of my annual best games list. Visually, audibly, narratively, and gameplay-wise, it is nothing short of excellent. Only time will tell whether it's a bold new direction for the entire franchise or a one-hit wonder, but whatever the case happens to be, this one hits unrelentingly hard.